Welcome to the Language Alchemy Podcast, and thank you for joining me today. This is your host, Alejandra Siroka, a transformative communication teacher and coach who is devoted to helping multicultural individuals and couples engaged in personal growth transform their lives and relationships through conscious communication. Thank you so much for being here today. In this episode, I continue the conversation with Dr. Scott Blossom, and I ask him more questions about the language of healing. The conversation with him was so rich that I divided it in two parts because I wanted you, my dear listener, to really let Scott's wisdom and information sink in before we could give you transformative communication tools. So this is part 2 of the conversation. And if you haven't checked part 1 yet, I highly encourage you to do so. That is episode 148 when we started this conversation. And in that episode, we discussed how we are multidimensional beings. And as such, when we are on a healing journey, even if the healing we're seeking is at a physical level, we also need to consider our language and how we are communicating. Because, for example, how a patient talks to themselves or how a doctor or a healthcare practitioner talks to them will greatly impact what happens in their attempt to restore health. In that conversation, Scott also told us about the 3 doshas or the 3 tendencies that all human beings have, and how those tendencies influence our ways of being, our communication, our thinking, and our ways of falling out of balance and how we can come back to balance. Finally, in that episode, we talked about the language of healing at a social level. And Scott shared how his language evolved after the murder of George Floyd. As you can tell, that first part was jam-packed with information and thought-provoking ideas. So again, if you haven't listened to it, check out episode 148. In today's episode, episode 149, we continue the conversation and we take it to a more personal and intimate level. You are going to hear how Scott works with his communication in his personal relationships and how having a specific shared language with his family is bringing a lot of healing to his son and to the relationship with him. This episode also has an abundance of communication goodies and great tools as well, because Scott will share specific approach to communication that he has with his family. He's going to do that step by step. And let me tell you, when I heard about his approach, I thought it was so useful and valuable, especially if you want to have deep, meaningful conversations with the people you love, or if you find yourself being in a conflict with them. So without further ado, here's part 2 of my conversation with Dr. Scott Blossom.
One thing that you and I have enjoyed a lot is singing together.
Yes.
When you mentioned transactional language, that when language is spoken in a way that is relational, there is a different quality to it, and it often has a more poetic quality. And there's a definition of wisdom that when you look at the etymology of the word for the word wisdom, wisdom has 2 kind of primary qualities. One of them is guidance. The other one is lyricalness. Like there's something about wisdom that comes out with a quality that actually enlivens something that you could say is from that more poetic side. And traditionally, in pretty much every culture, when they want to connect with the more than human world, they usually do it via song. But often song is the vehicle that unites the group to go into the state of communion with the larger relationships that they're interested in paying homage to and connecting with. And it reminds me of my mentor, Dr. Subodha. I knew this Swami in India. He was a very funny guy, and he used to say, you pay for every word, but singing's free.
Right.
You know, and so like you were saying too, especially in the modern, say, United States cultural environment, transactional language could seem like the only kind of language. It could seem
Yeah.
like that's what language is for. And in
Mm-hmm.
fact, that's one of English's virtues. It's an excellent transactional language because it's
Yeah.
almost built for that.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas a language like Sanskrit, where you have multiple meanings happening simultaneously for every single word in very different associations. English words will have multiple meanings, of course, but they're often nested around some core concept. It's much more particular. It's like individual names for individual widgets kind of specificity in English, whereas a lot of languages, the words were imbued with a lot more of that poetic, intuitive, lyrical power, and that it takes articulating speech in that way to inspire others to appreciate that even English is not a lost cause. If English
Mm-hmm.
is the primary language that you happen to think or speak in, by remembering that key point, I think it's so beautiful that you brought up about, is this transactional? If it's transactional, let's do transactional language. Like,
Mm-hmm.
be good at that language. It's a
Right.
skill. But if this is relational language, what does that imply? It implies not only just psychological well-being, because
Mm-hmm.
psychology also has its blind spot that's based in, you could say, post-colonial mindset. Psychology didn't emerge until after a
Right.
post-colonial time. And so psychology, when you look at it like Ayurvedic psychology or, indigenous psychology, like these psychologies that existed pre-colonial times, they are speaking a language that's relational, integrative, and communal. They are speaking multidimensional language by virtue of the mindset coming from that inclusive perspective and that reciprocal perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can't help myself right now to mention two things. One, that I recorded a whole episode giving listeners a checklist to go through to understand whether they're speaking in a transactional way or in a relational way. That's episode 145. I think it's called relational versus transactional communication, something like that. But two, when you were talking about English and the difference between English and Sanskrit, as
Yeah.
someone who has studied the history of English, that's what I had to study in one of my grad school programs. Can I tell you about the history of English? Because this is, yes,
Mm,
it's so relevant. So in the year 1066, William the Conqueror,
mm,
notice the name, conqueror, to conquer, right? Dominate. William the Conqueror. So the British Isles had been under governance of Normandy. The
mhm,
language spoken was French. The Normans were from France.
mm,
William the Conqueror was not from Normandy, and he wanted to be able to conquer, dominate the British Isles and
mm,
take it away from the French. So, what did he do? He understood that at that point in the British Isles, Latin was the language of highly educated people and
mm,
priests, religion.
mm. Yes.
The language of aristocracy was French and
Mm,
governance. In
mhm,
English was the language of the peoples. And what he understood was that if people were going to follow his cause to
yeah.
dominate and conquer the British Isles, then he needed to learn the language of the people.
Mm,
So for a whole year, he sent the only people who could scribe, who were priests.
uh-huh.
He sent them out throughout the British Isles to compile lists, glossaries, like dictionaries of what do you call this? I'm holding a cup right now, or it could be a mug, or it could be a vessel, or it could be a drinking container. What do you call this? What do you call that? And a year later, all these priests came back and they got together and they analyzed the language that different peoples used. This is when English grammar got much simpler. So we have do and does, and I'm not going to go over the explanation of the whole grammatical system in English, but we used to have, like in German languages and in Latin, the grammar was much more complex. and it got simplified. And that's when different priests said, well, in the North, they call this that I'm holding here a mug, but in maybe in the South, they call it a cup. Well, then we're going to call a cup something that has these characteristics. We're going to call a mug something that has these other characteristics.
Mm.
This is when English became such a rich language in terms of very specific and precise vocabulary. So
Mm.
in English, we have words like, think about seeing with your eyes. We have see, look, watch, stare, glance, skim. So many
Visualize.
different. Say that again.
Visualize. Yeah.
Visualize, right? Imagine, like, so many different words that are related to looking. Whereas in other languages, you have to say things like, you're looking at something for a long time. You're looking at something for a short period of time. You're
Mm.
looking at something quickly. You're looking at something that's moving. You have to
Uh,
explain, but you use the same word, look. But in
right.
English, we have all these different words. And English has the most number of borrowings from any language in the world. English
Mm.
borrows from Arabic, from Greek, from French, from Latin, from German, from so many different languages and older ancient languages, more ancient languages as well. So English was, as you accurately intuited and said earlier, it was developed as a language of conquest, as a transactional language for the purpose of domination.
That's an interesting twist about the underlying
Yeah,
purpose.
yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So it is true. Yeah. And when we get to the more wise language, and the etymology of wise is also related to the etymology of wild. When we're
Mm.
wise, we're in our wild nature
Yes.
that has
Mm.
unconditioned nature. Then, yeah, language is more lyrical, more metaphorical, storytelling, more relational, less transactional.
Yes.
There's so many things that I'd love to ask you,
Yeah.
but the last thing I'll ask you is, as you mentioned, you have two children, and one of them who's a teenager who's
Mm.
been going through some rough
Yeah.
experiences in his life lately, and
Teenager
you shared
initiation.
with me. Say that again.
I said teenager initiation.
Teenager initiation. Yes. When you come in contact with pain and that loss of innocence that you
Yeah.
have from childhood, right? You shared with me that in the program, the healing program that he's doing, there's a focus on healing communication
Yeah.
approaches. So, can you share a couple of things you learned from there?
Yeah. Thank you. It's been a tender period of time for our whole
Yeah.
family.
Yeah.
But thank goodness we ended up having him go to a wilderness therapy program. Those programs have a really mixed reputation. We got the recommendation for a program in Duchesne, Utah called Second Nature from a good friend. And so we felt confident, and it turned out that it was an incredible program. It was 3.5 months living in the wilderness and learning things like making fire and just having a very, what you would call, primitive existence, but wonderful, very, very professional program. And the core piece of the skill is a communication pattern that involves how you will essentially take responsibility for your place in a communication about something, especially if there's strong feelings. It just has 5 steps. And I want to say before I explain it is that the, the founders who they took it from other models, of course, but they give this beautiful, educational talk about why they use that with kids and why it's so important for families to learn to have this as a shared language. The founder says some people bristle at the simplicity of it, and they just feel like they don't want to be sort of straitjacketed into the structure of it. But he said, just give it 20 years. Just don't mess with it for 20 years and then innovate all you like, because
Right.
people want to jump. And so it's essentially, I feel, and I'm going to identify one or more feelings. I feel when, and you try to give a concrete situation where you felt that trigger. And then the third statement is, I feel this way because I believe. So now you start taking ownership about attitudes and beliefs that are there
Wow, beautiful.
behind what it is. And in the moment too, it's a very emergent and discovery kind of process. It's not as if I know what I believe, but when I am asking, when part of the rules of engagement out of respect and to create safety with, especially talking with your teenager, which with parents and teens, it can get so emotional so fast and go off the rails into something that is not productive, that
Oh, yes.
doesn't yield trust, respect, learning, any of that, love. And so then the fourth and fifth steps are, and my hope that is within my control, which again brings it back to what can I do? And then the second part of this, and my hope that's outside of my control. And that
Mm,
usually has to do with a request for them or something that you picture as a possibility for them, where you say it, and it has been so beautiful with my team. We've come to this confidence that everything's workable, even if
yeah.
it's terrible, even if
Yeah.
things are really, really hard and there's a lot of big feelings. We have a structure where it signals to each other, I'm going to follow this because I love you and I want you to feel safe enough to engage with this material that might be super, super charged from one side or both sides. And so, coming back to that first story, I'm going to stick with it for the next 20 years because I feel like with my son and I, it's grounded. We now have a cornerstone for our relationship. And the first time I went out and visited him in the wilderness, at the end of it, facilitator that was there during this time when he and I spent a lot of time just one on one was there with us out in the wilds, facilitating some very deep conversations and practice in person of it.
Hmm.
When we were all done, he asked my son last morning, how are you feeling? My son had just made fire the first time the night before, and he really wanted to do that in front of me. And so he
Oh.
had his dream come true. And then the facilitator asked him, how are you feeling? And he says, I'm feeling ecstatic. And the facilitator said, well, that's a strong one. That sounds great. Why are you feeling so ecstatic? And he said, because I realized I feel like my dad and I can talk about anything now.
Hmm.
And he had just had this beautiful experience of making fire. And I thought he was ecstatic because he had made fire because he's a
Yeah.
kid and he was super
Right.
proud of himself. But he basically, that was like the add on. The big
Yeah.
thing was, my dad and I can talk about anything now
Mm.
because the structure is workable and I've been working it and I know that I can use it, and I can use it with people my own age. I can use it with the figures of authority in this program that I'm in. And
Right.
now it's even workable in this most intimate relational
Mm.
situation with my father.
Oh,
So beautiful.
beautiful. Thank
Yeah.
you so much for sharing about the healing power of language and the importance of having shared language as a family
Yeah.
so that you can truly talk about anything. And I think that's one of the greatest gifts we
Yeah.
can give to one another. Wow, Scott, thank you so much for being here, for sharing your wisdom, your heart, your mind, your vulnerability, your
Yeah.
multidimensionality.
Yeah.
And I'd love people to know you. How can they reach out to you, find you? What do you have coming up? You always have something so good coming up.
They can find me at my website. That's the best place. Once again, it's DOCTOR, doctor spelled out Blossom. That's my last name, BLOSSOM.com. In the summertime, because people are busy, I just offer a yoga program. It's one class a week and it's recorded. Summer yoga is what it's called, pretty simple. Then I usually do a long course in the fall. And this year is going to be around the subject of sattva in the Ayurvedic tradition. And sattva implies the principle of balance, but it also it has ramifications psychologically and spiritually because it has to do with, at some level, the capacity of being accurate with perceptions, and also accurate when you know perception is distorted, because we have that level of ourselves that has the clarity to realize I'm deeply confused, I'm being self-destructive. And
Yeah.
the acknowledgement that is sattva. It's not that you somehow become an angel or perfect. And so much horrendous damage has been done in the name of purity and in the name of balance. These concepts are really charged. So we're intentionally going to bring that in. And I'll treat it how I usually do, where we're going to be working with, what's that look like when you are cultivating the sattvic principle in a dietary realm of your life? What does it look like in the in the realms of movement and rest? What does it look like in the realms of meditation and psychology? It's all going to be through the lens of the Ayurvedic medical system, and so we'll be using traditional texts and other things to sort of anchor something so people can be invited into this, as we were talking about, this very rich worldview that really helps us understand that we're always in relationship and that the context of our situation is going to influence us. So we neither completely blame ourselves or we don't collapse and just think, oh, it's worthless.
Yeah.
Nothing I'm going to do is going to work. It slows us down and centers us in a place where we hopefully build the strength and the capacity and grit to stay in relationship with ourselves and others. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to add all these links to the show notes. And then if people want to reach out to you on social media, where can they find you?
My Instagram post is Doc Blossom, DOC Blossom. I regularly, most weeks, I post something that is just general health information about things that are important. I try to give people low or no cost ways to cultivate their health in ways that are really important to some of the main preventable diseases and causes of death for modern folks.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, beautiful. Yes, Scott posts great videos every week with great advice and thought provoking ideas. So I highly recommend you follow him on Instagram. And Scott, wow, we can talk for days. Thank you so, so much. I'm deeply grateful. I love you. And thank you for all that you have given to my life, our lives with Matthew, and that you continue to give us. So thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you. I love you too, and thank you for your incredible service in the language alchemy that you are cultivating. It's such a beautiful thing to watch emerge. So yeah, from the
Mm,
bottom of my heart, you're one of my best friends, and you're
yeah.
also one of the people that I'm just in awe of. Especially,
Mm.
it's just deeper and deeper. It's like every birthday, I think for the last 3 birthdays or something, I've basically said, "Do you know that you're just getting more and more beautiful as you age?"
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, and I mean that
Mm,
in the sense of that richness, and I really the commitment you have to being in service to personal and collective healing. So thank you.
yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. What a beautiful conversation. Now I think you get an idea why I said in episode 148 that Scott is one of my number one influencers, teachers, and beloved friends. And by now, you're probably really curious about Scott's integrated offerings. To find out more, you can check out his website at drblossom.com, where you can sign up for treatments, online courses, and in person retreats. And you can also connect with him on Instagram at docblossom. You'll find all these links in the show notes. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Until next week. And as we say in Argentina, ciao, ciao.
Ciao, ciao.
Original music by Gary Lapo. You can find all links in the show notes at languagealchemy.com.